In Britain, The Guardian newspaper says it's uncovered a trail of so-called phone hacks done by or on behalf of Rupert Murdoch's tabloid, The News of the World, involving the phones of up to 3,000 people. The former Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott was one of those whose phones were reportedly hacked. He's furious.
I find it staggering that there could be a list known to the police of people who's had their phone tapped. I'm named as one of them. For such a criminal act not to be reported to me and not for action to be taken against the people who've done it reflects very badly on the police, and I want to know their answer.
The Guardian says Murdoch's papers have paid out more than £1 million, well over $2 million Australian dollars, to phone hacking victims. The reporter who broke the story in The Guardian is Nick Davies.
What we've uncovered is systematic activity by Rupert Murdoch's journalists on the Sunday newspaper here, The News of the World, using illegal techniques of one kind or another to uncover information. One bunch of illegal techniques is to do with using private investigators to do what's called blagging. That's conning their way into confidential databases, things like your bank statements, credit card statements, itemized telephone bills, tax records, all that kind of stuff. That's all illegal, and they've been doing it. And the second kind of illegal activity is using private investigators to do what's called phone hacking, which just means that they can get into other people's mobile telephone networks and hear messages which have been left on the target's mobile phone.
So that's why it's called hacking. It's not actually bugging a phone.
No, so they're not getting the live conversation, they're getting the messages which are left. And this started to emerge a couple of years ago when one particular journalist on this Murdoch paper, The News of the World, was busted and sent to prison when he was discovered, using a private investigator, to hack into the mobile phones of staff at Buckingham Palace who were working with Prince William. And at that time, the Murdoch executive said, well, he was a really bad guy, that reporter, and he was doing that secretly. We had no idea it was going on. So
it was the one bad apple argument.
All that stuff, and a bad apple we never knew was there, all that kind of stuff. So what then happened was that a completely different person, a guy called Gordon Taylor, who's the head of the kind of footballers union in this country, the Professional Footballers Association, he suspected that his phone had been hacked by journalists looking for sports stories from the News of the World. So he sued them. And the News of the World said, well, that's all rubbish, we never touched your phone. So Gordon Taylor's lawyers succeeded in getting what's called discovery. That's to say they got a court order which compelled the police to hand over any part of their investigation into the first reporter, Clive Goodman, which mentioned this man, Gordon Taylor. And lo and behold, there was all this paperwork which showed that they had indeed been hacking into his mobile phone. And it wasn't just the private investigator doing this on his own. There was clear evidence of News of the World journalists, including a middle-ranking executive, handling the raw material that was coming through from these intercepts.
How many phones were hacked?
Okay, so then the police seized masses of paperwork from this private investigator, and some of that has surfaced, but a lot of it hasn't. But my understanding is that that paperwork shows us that the News of the World were hacking the phones of 2,000 or 3,000 public figures of one kind or another. And some of these are very kind of soft Sunday paper targets like actors and reality television program stars, but some of it touches on senior politicians. So our former Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, is one of those who is certainly listed as a target for this private investigator who was engaging in all the mobile phone hacking.
While he was Deputy Prime Minister?
While he was Deputy Prime Minister. And, I mean, you know, he's talking to the intelligence services, he's engaged with all kinds of sensitive political stuff.
So the obvious question arises immediately there, and I believe he's raised this himself, why, if the police knew this, did they not take it further?
It's a question that needs to be asked. I mean, in two different senses. One is the police didn't go and warn all the people who had been targeted that they had been targeted, so that they could think, well, Christ, what else has come out? And secondly, they didn't pursue charges against the Murdoch journalists. And I don't know the answers to these questions, but it raises the worrying possibility, and it's only a possibility at this stage, that the police at New Scotland Yard didn't want to get into a fight with powerful Rupert Murdoch.
Because the Murdoch papers are so powerful in Britain.
And he's politically very powerful. And that may sound a bit of a daft conspiracy theory, but you remember I was saying that at an earlier stage, they raided another private investigator and got information about blagging into confidential records like bank statements and the rest.
Yep.
The private investigator who was raided, whose paperwork disclosed all that, was raided by an organization here called the Information Commission, and it's their job to protect confidential databases. Now, I know for sure that in that case, they had evidence of Murdoch journalists and other journalists commissioning illegal acts. And on that occasion, they decided that the newspaper groups were simply too powerful and too rich. Their fear was that if they tried to take them to court, the newspaper groups would hire very expensive lawyers and have masses and masses of preliminary hearings to argue legal points, and it would simply bust the budget of the Information Commission's legal department. So they said they're just too big a target. We're not going to touch them. So with that stuff, they busted the private investigators who were involved and never touched the newspaper groups. So you begin to get this alarming picture of the newspaper groups drifting beyond the reach of the law because they're just too powerful.
This has a political dimension too, because the editor of the News of the World at the time of some of this is now the spokesman for the man who could quite possibly be the next Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Cameron. Could he not have known about this?
Well, we don't know the answer to that question either. I've asked him over the last few days by email, and he's not given me an answer. But his position now is quite difficult, because if you look at it historically, when that first reporter, Clive Goodman, the royal reporter, was sent to prison, Andy Coulson, then his editor, resigned. He said, I didn't know that this was going on, but I take responsibility. Now, if he resigned over the isolated bad behavior of one reporter, should he now resign over the systematic bad behavior, illegal behavior of numerous reporters against numerous targets? And the thing gets worse, because if there is any suggestion that he did know about this and did sanction it, I say if there is, then it really is very difficult to imagine a man who has that history going right into the center of power in this country. If David Cameron is elected Prime Minister next year, Andy Coulson would be at his right hand, involved in all sorts of the most sensitive work that a government can be involved in. Can you have a man there if it turns out that he's been commissioning criminal behavior in his previous job?
And what about Mr. Murdoch? He apparently has told Bloomberg that if it had happened, if these payments had happened, he would know about it. Do you believe that?
He's saying he didn't know that the payments were made to silence these legal actions. Is that right?
I'm reading that actually out of The Guardian. Murdoch told Bloomberg News last night that he knew nothing about the payments. If that had happened, I would know about it, he said.
Well, then there's going to be a hell of a row inside Rupert Murdoch's company, because there's no question his legal department paid out more than £1 million to Gordon Taylor, who I've mentioned, and to two other people from the world of football who sued. So Murdoch's money went to those people's pockets in damages and in costs. If that was done without Rupert's knowledge, then he's going to be pretty furious. He's going to want his £1 million back. But it definitely happened.
Nick Davies, a journalist with Britain's Guardian newspaper, who broke that story.